When Moses died on Mount Nebo, a creature was already waiting at the bottom of the mountain, Samael. The accuser of heaven had come not to mourn, but to collect a soul that God himself had marked. The Bible buries this war in a single verse, one sentence. A door slammed shut, but the forbidden texts do not close it. They describe a courtroom without walls where the greatest prophet's soul hung between accusation and record, where the angel of death drew a sword, and the desert remembered every miracle, where a being called Metatron opened a scroll no accuser could edit. This is not mythology. This is the trial they tried to seal. Chapter 1. The verse that opens the forbidden door. Moses reached the mountain with a nation behind him and a grave before him. Below, Moab lay silent beneath a bruised and holy sky. Across the Jordan, the Promised Land waited like a sealed inheritance. He had carried Israel through plagues, fire, thirst, rebellion, and terror. He had heard the voice from the burning bush. He had stood before Pharaoh while Egypt cracked under judgment. He had climbed Sinai into smoke, thunder, and unbearable light. He had come down carrying law carved by the finger of God. But now he stood where even prophets are not allowed to pass. He could see the promise, he could not enter it. This is already frightening. Not because Moses failed like an ordinary man, but because even intimacy with God did not cancel judgment. The hand that split the sea would not split this final boundary. The mouth that spoke with God would still fall silent. And Deuteronomy gives the ending with terrifying restraint. Moses dies in Moab. He is buried in the valley opposite Beth Peor, and no one knows the place of his burial to this day. That single detail turns death into a locked room. Why hide the grave? Why erase the location of the greatest prophet's resting place? Why let the most important body in Israel's memory disappear from human reach? The surface answer is protection. The deeper answer feels more dangerous. Some remains are not hidden because they are worthless. Some are hidden because they would become too powerful. A grave can become a shrine. A shrine can become an obsession. An obsession can become a door. What exactly was heaven afraid would crawl out? And Moses was not only a prophet, he was the living witness of the covenant. If enemies could not break the law while he lived, perhaps they would try to accuse him when he died. This is where the New Testament fragment becomes terrifying. Jude says Michael disputed with the devil over the body of Moses. It gives us the echo, not the chamber. It tells us there was a dispute, but not the full charge. It gives us the rebuke, but not the entire trial. The Lord rebuke you. Those words sound less like a battle cry than a courtroom boundary. Michael does not answer slander with slander. He invokes the higher judge. That means the dispute was not chaos. It was legal. It was cosmic. It was accusation under the shadow of divine authority. An accusation is Samael's territory. Chapter 2. When death waited outside the mountain. Later, tradition sharpens the silence into a scene of dread. Samael waits for Moses' final hour. Not with grief, not with reverence, but with expectation. The accuser watches the prophet's life narrow toward its last breath. Every moment becomes a measure on an invisible scale. Every old failure becomes potential evidence. Every act of anger, hesitation, and disobedience becomes a possible weapon. Samael does not need to defeat Sinai. He only needs to find one crack in the servant of Sinai. That is the horror of accusation. It does not invent a soul from nothing. It searches history for a wound it can rename as ownership. Moses had struck the rock. Moses had been barred from the land. Moses had carried a people who broke faith again and again. Samael could point toward judgment and whisper possession. He could say the sentence proves the claim. He could say the grave belongs to death. And then the mountain would no longer be only a place of farewell. It would become the first chamber of the trial. Chapter 3. Samael draws the sword. The traditions do not portray Samael as a simple demon from later imagination. He is darker because he stands near the machinery of judgment. He is the accuser, the adversarial presence, the one who turns guilt into a chain. In the tale of Moses' death, Samael is sent toward the prophet's soul. He comes armed, wrapped in anger, bearing the confidence of the grave. That image matters. Death does not arrive weeping. Death arrives with authority. It believes the final hour gives it permission. It believes no human face can make it step back. But Moses is not facing death as an ordinary soul. His body still carries the memory of Sinai. His eyes have seen what armies could not survive. His staff has carried signs no earthly weapon can imitate. His voice has spoken plagues into empire. His hands have lifted over a sea and watched creation obey. So when Samael approaches, the expected order begins to break. The hunter finds that the hunted is still standing. The accuser finds that the witness is not afraid. The angel of death finds a man whose soul does not open. This is the reversal that makes the legend burn. Moses does not plead with Samael. Moses resists him. The sword comes near the prophet, but the prophet's presence becomes a wall. The sword came down. It stopped in the air above the prophet's chest, as if the atmosphere itself had turned solid. The desert itself seems to remember every miracle. Sand remembers the path through the sea. Stone remembers water. The air remembers commandments. And the staff in Moses' hand remembers the name. Samael has come to collect a soul, but the soul belongs to a history that heaven has not abandoned. The accuser cannot simply touch what God has marked. He cannot drag away what the covenant still surrounds. And then the horror turns upward. Because if Samael cannot take Moses by force, he must try to take him by argument. That is when the battle stops looking like combat and starts looking like a trial written in fire. Metatron enters this story not as a replacement for Michael. He enters as the terrifying witness of record, the one who stands beside the scroll no accuser can edit. Later, mystical tradition imagines Metatron near the throne, tied to record, presence, and divine order. For this episode, he is not a swordsman, he is worse. He is the one who knows what the verdict already allows. Samael brings accusation. Metatron brings memory. Samael points to failure. Metatron points to covenant. Samael points to the sentence outside the promised land. Metatron points to the voice that still called Moses servant. And every word spoken between them changes the meaning of death. Because if Samael wins, Moses becomes proof that even the greatest can be claimed. If Metatron's record stands, Samael only proves his own limit. The mountain becomes a courtroom without walls. The sky becomes a sealed archive, and Moses stands between the grave and the throne. Chapter 4. The record answers the accuser. Samael's first weapon is not the sword, it is interpretation. He looks at Moses barred from the land and calls it rejection. He looks at the hidden grave and calls it shame. He looks at the final hour and calls it defeat. That is how the accuser works. He does not always lie by inventing events. He lies by naming them wrongly. Metatron's answer is not rage, it is the record. The record says Moses was judged, but not abandoned. The record says Moses died, but not as Samael's property. The record says the grave was hidden, but not because heaven was ashamed. It was hidden because heaven knew what humanity would do. It was hidden because enemies would search for leverage. It was hidden because sacred memory can become corrupted possession. And in that moment, the battle becomes larger than Moses. It becomes a question about every holy thing left in human hands. Can revelation survive obsession? Can a prophet's body remain a testimony without becoming an idol? Can the enemy use even a grave as a weapon? The answer falls over Moab like a shadow. Yes, that is why no one was allowed to find it. That is why the location of the burial was not forgotten. It was erased, not by accident, by design. And if the accuser could not claim the body, he would try something else. He would bring the argument to the throne itself. Chapter 5. The grave, heaven erased. The argument reached the throne, and then descended back to Moab. Imagine Samael after the failed approach. Not defeated in the simple way, worse, limited. He cannot seize the soul. He cannot rewrite the record. He cannot turn judgment into ownership. So he turns toward the body. If the soul cannot be taken, perhaps the remains can be contested. If Moses cannot be possessed, perhaps his grave can be found. A body can become evidence. A burial place can become a claim. A relic can become a throne for corrupted devotion. This is the dread hidden inside the restraint of Deuteronomy. No one knows his burial place. Not kings, not priests, not enemies, not pilgrims, not the ones who would weaponize memory. The valley keeps its mouth closed. The mountain gives no direction. The dust of Moab does not betray the servant of God. And perhaps that silence is not emptiness. Perhaps it is security, a divine quarantine around the final witness of Sinai. In this hour, Metatron stands over that silence like an archive forged from light, not guarding a location, guarding the absence of a location. Because some secrets are not preserved by being written down. Some secrets are preserved by being removed from the world entirely. Samael searches the logic of death and finds a missing page. He searches accusation and finds a sealed line. He searches the valley and finds no grave to claim. And that is when the story becomes unbearable. Because heaven did not only take Moses from life, heaven took him from human access entirely. The people received the law, they received the memory, they received the warning. But they did not receive the body. There would be no visible tomb to control, no sacred remains to own, no final object around which ambition could gather and rot into worship. Moses belonged to God in death as he had belonged to God in life, and that is what Samael could not endure. The accuser feeds on unfinished guilt, but the end of Moses was not unfinished, it was sealed. The punishment stood, the mercy stood, the covenant stood, the grave vanished, and the enemy was left arguing with a silence that would not answer him. Chapter 6. The Soul. No angel could steal. The most dangerous part of the legend is not that Samael came. It is that Samael had permission to approach. Death was allowed near the prophet. Accusation was allowed to speak. The trial was allowed to open. But permission is not ownership, and proximity to judgment is not victory. At the final threshold, Moses is not taken by Samael. He is not dragged into shadow. He is not left as disputed property between heaven and accusation. The tradition remembers something far more unsettling. God himself receives the soul, not because Moses escaped death, but because death was not trusted to handle him. Think about that. The mechanism of mortality itself was deemed unworthy to process what remained of Sinai's witness. The mountain goes still. The accusing sword loses its purpose. The heavenly record closes around a verdict no appeal can touch. Metatron stands as eternal witness to what cannot be reopened. And Samael is left outside the sealed mercy with nothing but the echo of his own accusation. He came to claim a prophet and found a locked archive. He came to seize a soul and found a throne. He came to steal a body, and the body was simply gone. And somewhere below, in a valley no map can master, no pilgrim can find, no enemy can desecrate. A grave disappears so completely that even history cannot point to it. This is the final dread of the death of Moses. Not that the enemy almost won, but that the enemy was close enough to show us exactly what he wanted. The body, the soul, the memory, the law, the entire witness of Sinai turned into evidence against humanity. And heaven answered with one final act of concealment. The soul was taken upward. The body was hidden below, and the accuser was left between them, holding nothing. This is not a legend. This is a cover-up that is still standing. If this battle was only a myth, why did the graves still need to vanish? Write your theory in the comments. What did Samael want most? The soul, the body, or the memory of Moses? I read everyone. And if this opened a door you cannot close, do not leave it half open. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and descend with us into the next forbidden archive. The next record is already waiting in the dark.